I grew up in California, in America, and where I'm from, freedom of speech, it's like in my DNA. You know, everybody is free to speak their mind. And it's the same here in the UK. At least I thought it used to be. And I've lived here now for 20 years, and I've always felt this is a place where we can always speak our minds. You might not agree with someone, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Period. I might not agree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it so we can have an open and an honest debate and the best idea wins. That's always marked the upsurge of human civilization since the dawn of time. And so when I looked even deeper into freedom of speech, I started to really understand what was happening with this, because I think it's our most basic, fundamental, human civil right to speak our minds. But we always haven't had that right. I think we've kind of gotten used to the fact that we have it. And so I actually went back in history to really understand what it was all about. And the first thing that you might think about that gets quoted all the time is the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And in 1791, the original Constitution was amended with what I call new technology, things they hadn't thought of. And one of the first things they did, again, the First Amendment to that Constitution, was to say that Congress shall make no law prohibiting or abridging the freedom of speech. Again, it's the First Amendment. It's not the 5th, the 10th, or the 20th. It's the first. Very important in the early stages of the United States that they made sure people could speak their mind, because they knew if you couldn't, it could lead down some very dark times. On top of that, the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10 states, quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers." Very important. Finally, the United Nations, created in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, states in Article 19, quote, "We all have the right to make up our own minds, to think what we like, to say what we like, and share our ideas with other people." Again, these are in our DNA in Western civilization, and we assumed they were true. And if you look back through some of the big events in history, what would have happened if people hadn't have spoken their minds? Look at the Magna Carta in 1215, right? That said that everybody, including the king, was subject to law, right? That changed the course of everything in this country and everything in the Western world. Next, what if Martin Luther was never able to nail his theses to the door in 1517 in Europe? What would have happened? We wouldn't have had an entire evolution of human thought. What if the founding fathers of America had never created the Declaration of Independence in 1776? Again, it was them putting out new ideas that were controversial. What if Martin Luther King could have never given his "I Have a Dream" speech on the Washington Mall in 1963? What if he had never given that speech? Would we have had the civil rights reforms that we saw? These are crucial moments in human history where if we didn't allow someone to speak their minds, or they didn't speak it anyways, regardless of the repercussions, we still might be stuck in the Middle Ages, quite literally. And that's why this stuff is so important. And I wanted to give you that history lesson because a lot of people today don't know the history. They don't know it's a right because they've always assumed it's there. And when you start taking your liberties for granted and you start giving them away piece by piece, which is what we're doing today with our digital platforms, and I'll come to that, pretty soon you're going to wake up one day and you'll realize that you're in a society you don't like, where you can't say what you want, you can't think what you want, you can't do what you want, because those rights have been taken away from you. And that's actually what's been happening in 2020, and I want to get into it more. I want to ask you a question right now. Do you think, be honest with me, as an adult, that you should have the right to consume any information you want? Or do you think someone like the government or your social media platforms should protect you from consuming dangerous information? That's my question for you. So type in the chat right now. Tell me what you want to think. I get stopped on the streets all the time and people say, Brian, I just want to make my own decision. Or someone will stop me in the streets and say, Brian, one of your guests, I think they're crazy. I'm like, great. You got to make that opinion because you got to listen to them. If it was up to our government and our social platforms, you would have never even seen that video. And so again, it's all about choice and it's all about your choice. And so while you're typing those questions in, please tell me what you think as well. Again, tell me also, is freedom of speech important? Do you think censorship is wrong? And while you're doing that, I want to play a short video clip of a discussion I had with Dave Rubin, who hosts the Dave Rubin Show, super popular in America. And I was speaking to him about freedom of speech earlier this year on our Digital Freedom platform. And this was his take on the concept of freedom of speech.
So from an American perspective, look, we have the First Amendment here, which guarantees our ability to say basically whatever we want. I think that the First Amendment is probably the greatest sort of man-made, written, codified piece of legislation that has ever been written down on a piece of paper. The idea that you can say what you want, you are free to think what you want, you are free to worship how you wish to worship or not worship if you don't wish to worship, the fact that you can protest your government. These are wickedly amazing things that our founding fathers put into law and made the First Amendment, right? I mean, this isn't the Seventh Amendment, this is the First Amendment. Now, of course, in the United States, there are very, very limited parameters around that, meaning you can't call for direct violence to a person or a group of people. You can't just say, oh, let's go get those guys and kill them, or rally up troops to go kill people. So I think most of us can get on board that. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater with the intent of stirring up a mob. That's actually an important distinction, because technically you can yell fire in a crowded theater if it was a joke or something like that. But with the intent of creating chaos, you cannot do it. That's just like a little bit of an extra thing that a lot of people don't know, a little asterisk there. And then, of course, we have extremely, extremely stringent, tight laws about libel and slander, that you can't destroy people's reputations, but the laws around them are so tight that they're almost never used. It's very rarely used. So I think we have done what I would say are the best modern protections around freedom, period. Now, what you're referring to specifically, so I did hear about this interview being censored a few weeks back. I don't know the specifics of it, so I don't want to comment on the specifics of the topic necessarily. But in terms of sort of big tech censorship, what we're now dealing with is there's a secondary layer. So the government can say, hey, you can do whatever you want, that's just fine. But the way we all communicate now, whether it's streaming on YouTube or talking on Twitter or going on Facebook or Instagram or any of these giant platforms, this has become the new way we communicate. And, there is an argument that, we need to treat these things like the phone company. In other words, everyone can have a phone in their house in the UK and in the United States, and in most free countries, you can have a phone in your house. They can't take away your phone depending on if they like what you're talking about or not. Now, so that's a little bit more of a regulation, a government regulation argument. I actually don't love that argument, because I fundamentally, and this is more my libertarian side, I fundamentally believe in human ingenuity. I fundamentally believe in competition. I believe that giant things that seem too big to fail almost always fail. Giant companies of the past that we thought were these monolithic things that would rule us forever, they crumble, then new ones come. Google will not always be Google. Amazon will not always be Amazon. Now, we do have a particularly unique situation right now, because big tech looms so large over every part of our lives because of our phones that are in our pockets, and microphones and cameras, and the fact that Google owns YouTube. Google's the #1 search engine. YouTube's the #2 search engine. They also, Facebook owns Instagram. Like, there really has become this giant business structure that is hard to also figure out, is that connected to the government? Is it the government? I mean, I think these are all interesting things to talk about. My personal preference would be that we find other ways around it, using our mind, using our creativity, and that by being sort of small and nimble, that we can solve the big tech problem, as opposed to saying to the government, hey, you giant government have to fix this other giant problem, because then you just take two giant things and make them bigger. And, to take something from the Bible, it's like, well, David beat Goliath, right? So maybe Dave can beat Google. That's what I always say about this. So I think there are solutions. We could probably spend 8 hours talking about tech censorship and the arguments on either side. Believe me, I hear plenty of good arguments for the regulation side of this too. And maybe there's a happy medium in there somewhere. But with an American election ramping up and everything else, it's like, this is in many ways, I think you could make an argument that this is a bigger issue than coronavirus in many ways.